This leads to our last question. How should leaders deal with greed and corruption in their own organization? This involves both direct leadership in face-to-face relations and indirect leadership through the facilitation of systems. However, I will suggest that this issue also involves questions of moral self-leadership. The leader needs to confront greed in his or her own life before she deals with it on an organizational level. As James O'Toole suggests, effective change begins when leaders effectively begin to change themselves. I will therefore draw on the theories of moral leadership in the following discussion, which seek to be practical in the sense that I will outline some rules of art for anti-greed leadership. Basically, I will suggest that leaders might fight greed in their organization through the execution of 4 disciplines. Discipline 1. Seeking to become servant leaders that models personal integrity through persistent ethical commitments. Above, I have suggested that the temptation of greed must be dealt with on the context of the existential questions we all face. What kind of person do I want to be? And what kind of leader do I want to become? Søren Kierkegaard suggests that we become who we are depending on how we respond to certain existential choices that we face in different stages of life. For our purpose, it might be useful to begin with the choice of moving into an ethical stage by committing oneself to an ethical life project. This submission of the self to moral principles might beget the kind of servant leadership that, according to Robert Greenleaf, begins with a natural feeling that one wants to serve first. This basic commitment will involve a series of ethical commitments that over time may inspire the formation of a person with ethical integrity. Some versions of Christian theology with roots in the theology of St. Augustine might articulate this slightly differently. Since a person is seen as a complex and yet sinful creature that has to struggle with his or her own greed after she or he has entered Kierkegaard's ethical stage. To put it in psychological terms, the human tendency to narcissism may inspire not only greed, but also hide it under forms of pseudo-service. Leaders who will lead against greed must therefore learn to admit and repent from greed and acknowledge that the inner fight for integrity calls for personal humility and interpersonal accountability. In the Christian tradition, this also includes a transforming spirituality, or what Kierkegaard would call the religious stage of life, where a relationship with God and His grace overcomes greed and empowers moral service. It is nevertheless clear that regardless of where one anchors one's identity and moral battles, ethical leaders must seek to develop virtues that overcome the human tendency of greed. These virtues obviously include moderation, which is a discipline of drawing boundaries, or what Charles Handy defines as the law of enough. Aristotle views the capability of moderation, or soundness of mind, as the ability to find a mean that creates a balance in relation to all forms of pleasure. Theologians like Paul Otto Brunstad and Graham Tomlin argue that greed is also defeated by other virtues, such as generosity and thankfulness. Generosity is expressed through a lifestyle of caring and giving that is rooted in a basic attitude of thankfulness that sees life as a gift. Generosity can be understood as both joyful and wise sharing of one's resources, and is a superior antidote to greed and stinginess because it sets limit on acquisition and focuses on the other who we give to. Tomlin also makes a final point that is highly relevant for the development of moral leaders. He contrasts greed with rest and the enjoyment of life that was institutionalized in the Jewish Sabbath. This is, in my view, an important reminder because one's own greed as well as pressure from others may spur leaders to overwork themselves. A balanced model of servant leadership should also include, therefore, a responsible self-care that creates a theory of limits that protects the leader from his or her own greed and from the greed of others. Moral role modeling is therefore not only performed in front of others, but also comes from within and should be given as a gift towards one's closest co-workers. Above, I have suggested that greedy leaders seek to control their best co-workers in ways that threaten their dignity and autonomy. In contrast, ethical and serving leaders empower by exemplifying integrity, generosity, and care, not only in front of, but also towards their closest co-workers. Robert Greenleaf suggests that servant leadership can be tested on whether those who are led become healthier, wiser, freer, and more autonomous, and more likely to become servants themselves. When the condition of integrity is fulfilled, the leader can move into service on the level of visionary, task-related, and relational leadership.